and carbon dioxide is 40 millimeters of mercury. Again, the same as in a respiratory zone. It is a very high yield for the USMLE, please note this. This also means that a sample of expired gas taken near the end of expiration is representative of the respiratory zone and is called end tidal air. Remember it because later we will talk about it. End tidal air. As for the anatomic dead space gas composition at the end of inspiration, it differs when compared to the end of expiration. Again, the gas composition is constant in a respiratory zone. PO2 is 100 and PCO2 is 40 millimeters of mercury. When a person starts breathing in, first 150 mL of air comes from the anatomic dead space, not from the tidal volume. It is the air that remained in a dead space at the end of expiration and has the same composition as alveolar air. After the first 150 mL enter the alveoli, 500 mL from the inspired tidal volume comes into your lungs. But it also will be divided into two parts. First, 350 mL from the 500 mL of the tidal volume will be added to the respiratory zone air, and the remaining 150 mL stays in a conducting zone. Thus, at the end of inspiration, the anatomic dead space is filled with humidified room air and has the same composition as the room air. The partial pressure of oxygen in a room air is 160 millimeters of mercury, and PCO2 is considered to be 0 millimeters of mercury. So, at the end of inspiration, anatomic dead space has the humidified room air, therefore, the partial pressure of oxygen slightly drops to 150 millimeters of mercury, but PCO2 is as the room air, 0 millimeters of mercury. About composition of room air and atmospheric air, there are different statements, and I don't think it would be very important for the USMLE. But anyway, the main important thing for the USMLE you have to remember is that some sources say that the room air has more carbon dioxide when compared with atmospheric air. They say that atmospheric air PCO2 is 0.
Hi guys, so today we are going to be focusing on the Bohr effect, and this is a physiological effect first described by Christian Bohr in 1904. So the Bohr effect describes how the affinity of hemoglobin for oxygen changes depending on the carbon dioxide concentration. This means that the ability of hemoglobin to bind and hold on to its oxygen changes, and this changing efficiency facilitates efficient oxygen delivery. So each hemoglobin molecule consists of 4 subunits. Each subunit consists of a globular protein and a prosthetic heme group. The heme group consists of an iron-iron in an organic ring called a porphyrin. Oxygen binds to the iron-iron in the centre. In adults, the most common form of hemoglobin consists of 2 alpha protein subunits and 2 beta protein subunits, whereas infants predominantly have 2 alpha and 2 gamma protein subunits. So infant hemoglobin has a slightly different structure and therefore a slightly different binding ability. Each hemoglobin can bind up to 4 oxygen molecules because of these 4 separate subunits and therefore 4 separate heme groups. Active tissues are respiring and therefore producing carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide dissolves in the blood to form carbonic acid, which dissociates into its ions, eventually forming bicarbonate and hydrogen ions, and therefore lowers blood pH. In the region of active tissues, there's also going to be low oxygen because the oxygen is being used for respiration. Because carbon dioxide is a product of aerobic respiration, more active tissues produce more carbon dioxide, and therefore the blood in this area will have a lower pH. This causes greater dissociation of oxygen from the hemoglobin, and this is because hydrogen ions formed from carbonic acid bind to the beta subunits of hemoglobin. This is called protonation. Protonation allows new ionic interactions to form within the hemoglobin molecule, therefore causing it to adopt a more open structure. And this diagram here shows the two different states. The T state is its more open state, which is in the presence of a lot of carbonic acid, whereas in the R state it has a much higher affinity for oxygen and is therefore less likely to give it up. So you might be wondering about lactic acid. So lactic acid is produced during anaerobic respiration. Because anaerobic respiration produces fewer ATP molecules per cycle, it must occur more in order to release enough energy. And therefore lactic acid is going to be produced in greater quantities. This results in the production of more hydrogen ions and so lowers the pH even more. This causes hemoglobin to release even more oxygen to these tissues, which reflects these tissues' greater need for oxygen for respiration. This means that the affinity of hemoglobin for oxygen is proportional to the metabolic activity of tissue in that region. So that's how oxygen disassociates from hemoglobin, but what causes it to associate or join? In the lungs, oxygen affinity increases so that the hemoglobin load up on oxygen and are able to transport it around the body's tissues. The lungs have a high concentration of oxygen, and so it's very likely that the oxygen will bind to the deoxygenated hemoglobin. We call this having a high partial pressure. All that means is that there's a high concentration of oxygen. As oxygen binds to the hemoglobin, it causes the hemoglobin to release the previously bound hydrogen ions. These hydrogen ions recombine with bicarbonate to form carbon dioxide again, as well as water. The carbon dioxide can diffuse into the alveoli from the blood and is then exhaled, so it's removed from the blood. As this hydrogen leaves, the affinity for hemoglobin will increase again, and so the hemoglobin is able to hold on to its oxygen, and it won't release it readily until it reaches the active tissues. This is because the structure changes again to adopt the more closed structure. This graph shows an S-shaped curve which shows the saturation of hemoglobin with oxygen, varying with the partial pressure of oxygen and carbon dioxide levels. The higher the partial pressure of oxygen, the greater the saturation, and vice versa. And the greater the amount of carbon dioxide, the more the curve is shifted to the right. This shows that more dissociation has occurred, as the saturation of oxygen is less at a given partial pressure, and therefore shows as the amount of carbon dioxide increases, hemoglobin are less able to hold on to oxygen and therefore dissociate more, allowing it to be released to the nearby tissues. So although this graph might seem a bit complicated at first, once you break it down, it just shows how readily hemoglobin holds on to its bound oxygen, and therefore what the percentage saturation of the hemoglobin will be. So that's about it for the Bohr effect. Thank you so much for watching, and I really hope it was useful. If you found it useful, don't forget to like, comment and subscribe for more videos.
Armando Hasudungan Biology and Medicine videos. Please make sure to subscribe. Join the forum group for the latest videos. Please visit Facebook Armando Hasudungan. In this video, we are going to look at control of respiration. Now, the medullary respiratory centers control respiration. The medullary respiratory centers are made up of the ventral and dorsal groups. The ventral group is responsible for the rhythmicity, you can say, of breathing. If that didn't all make sense, let's look at a diagram. So here I'm drawing the brain. If we zoom into the brainstem region here, we can locate where the medulla oblongata is. Here I'm drawing 3 red circles. The 2 red circles here make up the medullary respiratory center, which is made up of the ventral and dorsal respiratory groups. The ventral being the front and the dorsal being the back. The dorsal group is responsible for inspiration, the diaphragm, and the ventral one is responsible for the rhythmicity of breathing. But then you have this other respiratory center located in the pons, known as the pontine respiratory center. The pontine respiratory center will interact with the medulla respiratory center to smooth respiration. It will provide tonic input to the medullary network here to help coordinate smooth respiratory rhythm. So they will send signals to here, and then the medullary respiratory centers will work together, and then will send signals for inspiration and expiration. So to understand how it sends signals for inspiration and expiration, let us look at the thorax. So here I am drawing the thorax, which is made up of the ribs here, as well as the sternum here. Now within the thorax we find the lungs. Beneath the lungs we have an important muscle known as the diaphragm. The diaphragm is one of the important muscles in respiration. And then you have another important muscle in respiration, which are known as the intercostal muscles, which run between the ribs. Here I'm drawing the trachea, which connects the larynx to the lungs. So in a very simplified way, the respiratory center will send impulses to the muscles of the lungs to trigger inspiration or expiration. So for example, here we have impulses being sent via neurons to the intercostal muscles to cause inspiration. So the ribs will rise. And the impulses are also being sent to the diaphragm to cause inspiration. So the diaphragm will descend. The respiratory center will send impulses to cause inspiration and expiration. The quicker the impulse, the faster the breathing. The slower the impulse, the slower the breathing. And that's an important concept to understand. Now, let us see what can influence the respiratory center. And so what can increase respiration, so increase breathing, and what can suppress breathing, so slow down breathing. Firstly, we have the higher centers of the brain, where we can have voluntary control. So as we know, we have some control over our breathing. We can stop breathing for a while before the brain just takes over. The higher centers of the brain are also important for the perception of pain, emotion, and temperature. And so all these factors can influence the respiratory rate. So they will firstly either stimulate or suppress the pontine respiratory center, which then will stimulate or suppress the medullary respiratory center and respiration itself. But the main regulator or influencer of respiration would be the peripheral chemoreceptors, which are located in the carotid and aortic bodies. they detect changes in the blood, chemical changes in the blood. So for example, if they detect a decrease in oxygen, a decrease in blood pH, which means an increase in hydrogen ions, and an increase in CO2, this will stimulate or trigger the chemoreceptors located here in the carotid bodies and aortic bodies, and they will stimulate these chemoreceptors to stimulate the respiratory center. And so when the respiratory center is stimulated, there'll be a quicker respiratory rate. So you will breathe in and breathe out quicker. And so you can breathe in more oxygen and you can breathe out more carbon dioxide to neutralize everything. There are also chemoreceptors located in the medulla known as central chemoreceptors. The medullary chemoreceptors do exactly the same thing. They can detect changes in pH. A decrease in pH, for example, and an increase in CO2 will stimulate the chemoreceptors to stimulate the respiratory center so that you could breathe faster, and thereby breathing out more carbon dioxide and inhaling more oxygen. You also have receptors in your muscles and in your joints, and these will be stimulated when you exercise. And so when you exercise, these receptors will stimulate the respiratory center so you can breathe quicker. And it's important to breathe quicker when you exercise so you can breathe so that you can take in more oxygen and you can blow out all the acid that has built up. And finally, you have things in your lungs that can regulate the respiratory center, that can influence the respiratory center in the brainstem. Firstly, you have things called irritant receptors, which are receptors that are protective in the lungs that help essentially blow off the irritant. And so when they're stimulated, they will suppress the respiratory center to slow down respiration. And then you have stretch receptors in the lungs, which cause the hearing breather reflex, a reflex that is protective. It's a protective reflex initiated by extreme overinflation of the lungs. And so when these stretch receptors are stimulated, initiated, they will suppress respiration. So they will slow down the respiratory rate. Hope you enjoyed this video. Thanks for watching.
මම chart එක explain කරලා දෙන්නම් ඔයගොල්ලන්ට. මේක explain කරද්දී ඉස්සෙල්ලම අපි පටන් ගන්න ඕනේ මේ normal කියන point එකකින්. normal කියන point එකකින් පටන් අරගෙන අපි ඉස්සෙල්ලම බලමු metabolic alkalosis පැත්ත කොහොමද වෙන්නේ කියලා. ඔයගොල්ලෝ normal කියන point එකෙන් පටන් අරගෙන උඩට යන්න arrow එක දිගේ. එතන ගියාම ඔයගොල්ලෝ නවතිනවා uncompensated metabolic alkalosis කියන තැනක. ඒ කියන්නේ compensatory mechanisms පටන් අරගෙන නැහැ. alkalosis එක compensate කරගන්න respiratory compensatory mechanisms පටන් අරගෙන නැහැ. කියන්නේ hypoventilation or hypoventilation. alkalosis එක නම් hypoventilation. respiratory mechanisms පටන් අරගෙන නැති නිසා තමයි ඔයගොල්ලන්ට බලන්න පුළුවන් carbon dioxide partial pressure එක 40ෙම ඒ level එකේම තියෙනවා. ඊට පස්සේ එතනින් පස්සේ arrow එක follow කරන්න. ඒ arrow එක දිගේ යනකොට එතන තියෙන්නේ compensatory mechanisms start වෙලා තියෙනවා compensate කරගන්න metabolic alkalosis එක. metabolic alkalosis එක compensate කරගන්න තියෙන compensatory mechanisms තමයි hyperventilation. hyperventilation කියන්නේ respiratory rate එක අඩු කරගෙන carbon dioxide ඇඟේ වැඩියෙන් accumulate කරගන්නවා. carbon dioxide ඇඟේ වැඩියෙන් accumulate කරගත්තම ඔයගොල්ලන්ට පේනවා පහළ මම chart එකට පහළ දාපු equation එකේ වැඩියෙන් carbon dioxide accumulate වෙනකොට ඒකේ සමීකරණයේ තුලිතතාවය යනවා වැඩියෙන් carbonic acid හැදෙන පැත්තට. වැඩියෙන් carbonic acid හැදෙනවා කියන්නේ වැඩියෙන් hydrogen ion හැදෙනවා. වැඩියෙන් hydrogen ion හැදෙනවා කියන්නේ ඇඟේ pH එක low level එකකට එන්න පුළුවන්. ගන්න තියෙන alkalosis එකට එක compensate කරගන්න පුළුවන් වෙනවා. කියන්නේ වැඩියෙන් hydrogen ions produce වෙනවා කියන්නේ alkalosis එක යම් ප්‍රමාණයකට compensate කරගන්න පුළුවන් වෙනවා ඇඟට. ඒත් එක්කම වැඩියෙන් hydrogen ion produce වෙනකොටම alkalosis එකක් තිබ්බත් වැඩියෙන් bicarbonate ion produce වෙනවා. මොකද carbonic acid එක කැඩිලා හැදෙන්නේ H+n bicarbonate ions. ඒක නිසා මේ chart එක ඔයගොල්ලන්ට බැලුවොත් බලා ගන්න පුළුවන්. ඒකේ y axis එකේ තියෙන plasma bicarbonate level එක. plasma bicarbonate level එක වැඩි වෙලා තියෙනවා compensated metabolic alkalosis එකේ. එහෙනම් compensated metabolic alkalosis එකේ තියෙන්නේ partial pressure carbon dioxide level වැඩි, hydrogen ions වැඩි, plasma bicarbonate levels වැඩි. දැන් අපි බලමු compensated and uncompensated metabolic acidosis ගැන. ආයතරම කලින් කිව්වා වගේ normal level එකකින් පටන් අරගෙන පහළට එන arrow එක දිගේ පහළට ආවට පස්සේ ඔයගොල්ලෝ එනවා uncompensated metabolic acidosis කියන තැනකට. එතනදී acidosis එකට against compensatory mechanisms මොනවද ඇඟේ පටන් අරන්නේ නැහැ. කියන්නේ hyperventilate වෙන පටන් අරගෙන නැහැ. එහෙනම් carbon dioxide ඇඟේ තියෙන standard level එකේම retain වෙලා තියෙනවා. ඒ කියන්නේ 40 millimeters per 40 level එකේ තියෙනවා. එතනින් පස්සේ arrow එක follow කරන්න compensated metabolic acidosis කියන තැනට එනකම්. එහෙනම් ඒ කොටසේදී compensatory mechanisms පටන් අරගෙන තියෙනවා. එහෙනම් compensatory mechanisms කියන්නේ hyperventilate වෙන පටන් අරගෙන තියෙන ඇඟ. hyperventilation කියන්නේ වැඩියෙන් carbon dioxide expel වෙනවා. එහෙනම් carbon dioxide partial pressure එක අඩු වෙනවා. එතන carbon dioxide partial pressure එක අඩු වෙලා 21ක් දක්වා ඇවිල්ලා තියෙනවා. එහෙනම් පහළ තියෙන සමීකරණය බැලුවම අර අපි alkalosis වල බැලුවා වගේම carbon dioxide පහළ වැටෙනකොට මේ සමීකරණයේ equilibrium එක එනවා වැඩියෙන් carbon dioxide produce කරන පැත්තට. ඒ කියන්නේ carbonic acids කැඩි වැඩියෙන් carbon dioxide එළියට යනවා. එහෙනම් H+ අඩු වෙනවා ඒත් එක්කම bicarbonate ion අඩු වෙනවා. මොකද මුළු සමීකරණයම වම් පැත්තට යනවා. එහෙනම් මුළු සමීකරණයම වම් පැත්තට යනවා. එතකොට metabolic acidosis එකදී වෙන්න ඕන carbon dioxide level එක අඩු වෙන්න ඕන. carbon dioxide level එක අඩු වෙනකොට ඇඟේ H+ අඩු වෙනවා. ඒක තමයි වෙන්න ඕන. මොකද acidosis එක balance කරගන්න පුළුවන් ඇඟේ තියෙන hydrogen ions අඩු වෙනකොට. hydrogen ions අඩු වෙනවත් එක්කම acidosis එකක් තිබුණත් මෙයාට bicarbonate ions උත් අඩු වෙනවා. ඒක සමීකරණයත් එක්ක බලුවට පස්සේ ඔයගොල්ලෝ හොඳට බලා ගන්න පුළුවන්. එහෙනම් compensated metabolic acidosis එකේ තියෙන්නේ එයාගේ carbon dioxide partial pressure එක අඩුයි, bicarbonate ions level එක අඩුයි, bicarbonate ions level එක අඩුයි. summary එකක් විදිහට ගත්තොත් compensated metabolic alkalosis එකේ carbon dioxide accumulation එකක් වෙනවා ඇඟේ වැඩියෙන් H+ හැදෙනවා ඒත් එක්කම වැඩියෙන් bicarbonate උත් හැදෙනවා. compensated metabolic acidosis එකක් ගැන අපි කතා කරොත් carbon dioxide partial pressure එක අඩු වෙනවා H+ ions අඩු වෙනවා ඒත් එක්කම bicarbonate ions උත් අඩු වෙනවා.